What's up, guys? In this video, I got 3 new grading related questions that every sports card collector and investor should at least consider asking themselves and answering before making a big card purchase to avoid that horrible feeling of buyer's remorse from either overpaying or flat out buying the wrong card. So with that being said, you already know the drill. Welcome back. Now let's get to work. So the first question is, how many of this card exists in a certain grade, and where do I feel this number would actually plateau at? And in real estate investing, there's a saying about buying land in areas where they can't build anymore. So essentially, if you invest in a downtown area, the amount of land is very limited, so you don't have to worry about a ton of new buildings popping up left and right. They would have to tear something else down to rebuild. But if you bought a plot of land way out in the suburbs, all of those empty plots could be turned into buildings. So the point is that with cards, we know that MJ PSA 10 is prime real estate, and there shouldn't be many more popping up anytime soon. But on the other hand, as I record this, there's almost 20,000 Zion Williamson Prism PSA 10s, and that's like buying a plot of land out in the suburbs, thinking that you have one of the only few plots that you can actually develop on, only to realize that every plot is going to be developed, which will then become your competition. So the moral of the story is to understand what supply will actually look like, because in a way, all other supply out there is your direct competition. This was perhaps the biggest lesson I learned this year, where I bought football cards very early in 2021 when the prices were really low, only to have those cards almost double in its PSA pop report, which diluted the value of the card. Now, I knew the pop would go up, but I also figured the interest in the hobby and football cards specifically would still outpace the increasing pop counts. So for example, I bought a handful of Kyler Murray Prism PSA 10s back in January for $360 to $420 or so, when there were 1,400-ish in existence. Now, 8 months later, there are over 2,300 PSA 10s in PSA's books. Now, if that number had only grown to 1,500 or 1,600, there's a good chance that this card would be sitting at $600 to $700 versus roughly the same price I paid at the beginning of the year. So at the end of the day, you can pick the right player, you could pick the right card and grade, but if you miscalculate the actual supply of it, you could still end up overpaying. So for now, I'd like to stick to cards that I believe will plateau around 1,000-ish unless it's an iconic card. And if a card is too scarce, it could definitely be valuable, but also very tough to come up with a fair price. So we could still easily overpay because there's just not enough data points out there to come up with a fair price. So just be careful when you're buying very rare cards. You could be getting a steal, or you could end up paying a lot more than you should. A follow-up question you can ask yourself to help understand what the pop count will actually grow to is, when would it have made sense to send this card in for grading, and under what service level? And if this card was pretty valuable prior to 2019, then more than likely the majority of that card in perfect shape have already made its way through the grading companies. But on the other hand, if it's a card that only became worth grading in the last 18 months or so, there's a good chance that many of them are still sitting in PSA's office. Now, what about the grading service? Because a Prism base rookie card of a player was probably not worth enough to be sent to PSA at $50 to $100, but if it was a silver or other parallel, maybe it was. So now part of my thought process is determining, when did this card become desirable to grade, and what service level would have made the most sense? And using Zion as an example, I bet way more of his Prism base cards were sent in under the bulk or economy service versus his silver. If you had that silver rookie card sometime last year, you could easily make the numbers work on several of the grading tiers because that card went up over $6,000. The last question has to do with the different grading companies, and this is tricky because each grading company is perceived differently by the hobby, and the values of their cards prove it, even if the card itself is in identical shape. So some companies like PSA make it very easy to move because it's currently the most accepted grading brand, while others make it very tough to move because the perception is so poor that its slab is almost like a scarlet letter to the card, which is obviously very unfortunate. So for me, I've had some poor luck with other grading companies. besides PSA. And even BGS, I'd have some cards that would move and then others that would just sit there so long. And for me, I'd rather just keep it simple and just stick with PSA. But if you are curious about the other grading companies and experimenting with cards there, then just ask yourself, if I were to crack this card and sell it raw as a 9 in some other grading company or as a 10 in another grading company, what do I think I'd be able to get for it? How much would it cost to cross over to a PSA or BGS when they do offer a more affordable service? Is this player established enough so that if this is a year or two down the road, they should still be very well into their career? They're not a younger player that could be a bust, but there's someone that's more established that they should be fine in a year or two from now, because maybe getting 9s or 10s of cards of other grading companies to later, just to hold for now, and then later either those grading companies go up in their perceived value, or you cross them over to PSA or BGS and you get your money there. That could be a great strategy, but only if the card is desirable in a year or two's time and the player is doing really well in their career, or they're a Hall of Famer or GOAT, in which case you're fine there as well. But I think the question is always like, what are all of my options with this card? Not just I have to sell it as is, because there are a lot of creative ways to add value to a card just by changing companies that put their mark on it. Some other questions I was going to include in here, but that weren't related to grading, but do find very important is, do I think this card actually looks good? And if not, do a lot of others think that it does? Because last year, it didn't really matter what a card looked like. Every single card out there seemed to have potential to go up in value. And now, as it's more of a nuanced, sophisticated hobby, aesthetics seem to matter a lot more, which is the way it should be. It's not just like a free-for-all. So if a card doesn't look good to me, but it looks good to a lot of other people, then I'll consider buying it, knowing that I'm the outlier. But if a card looks ugly to everyone I talk to, then it's probably not a card I want to buy, even if it's rare. Another one is there a lower risk investment opportunity that has the same or a similar upside as this one? And when we saw 80s and 90s and 2000s Hall of Famers and GOATs cards go up in March, that was a great correction for all the crazy high prices we saw on ultra modern cards of players that hadn't established much of a legacy or one at all. So for me, I'm always looking at, well, what is the player, what is the card, but what is the opportunity cost? What is another card that has lower downside but yet the same or similar upside? So I'm always going to be leaning towards the Jordans, the Kobes, the Tom Bradys, etc. going forward, unless it's 50 times the price, in which case I might say, hey, it's worth a gamble on this younger player. But when prices get too close, that's where I will go with the GOATs all day long. So just a question that I'm being a bit more intentional about this go around. And the last one was, is there perhaps a better time to buy in, because I just don't feel very confident right now? And when we see these numbers coming back from PSA and all these cards coming back, I still look at it like dust being thrown up in the air, where we're trying to create a clear picture of what's out there and what the supply of each card and of all that's going to look like. And it's still murky right now. So I don't mind waiting and missing some opportunities in order to miss losing money or taking gambles that just aren't worth it. And so that's where, if things don't really feel right with me, I don't mind waiting, because opportunity is always going to be there. There's always going to be some sort of opportunity for us, but I would rather not have that FOMO. I'd rather just learn and then strike when I feel everything is lined up the way that makes sense to me. So if you ever feel like FOMO or you need to dive into an investment right away, just remember there's always going to be opportunity. It might just be a different opportunity in 6 months or a year's time. So when it comes down to understanding the whole grading and supply side of cards, let me know in the comments section what has changed for you over the last year, year and a half in terms of the questions or filters you're asking yourself when you go in on an expensive card. You guys know I love learning from you as well. Have a great week, and I will see you guys next time.